Okay, continuing our conversation this week, Chapter 13, Regulatory Compliance for Financial Institutions. I'm going to move through this a little quicker, try and do it in one lesson. If you're financially motivated or you work in a financial institution, study this chapter in detail. Good for you. But for most of us, just a high level is way to go. Money, in the end, is fungible, right? It is able to be replaced, right? It is by no means the only commodity in the world, right? Protection of the information of a customer, that is not really fungible. That is something we must do, because once you've lost trust, it's really hard to move on. So these are the objectives for this lesson. As an introduction, then we want to adhere to the financial institution's assets, but we want to protect really the information assets more importantly. That was the goal of the comments I just made. So the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act, or GLBA, is one thing that we often refer to. That's on page 409. This was started during the Great Depression, during the Banking Act. And frankly, it was a way to affiliate or identify banks from security companies, right? So that not everything collapsed at once, right? And part of the Glass-Steagall Act of 1956 prohibited banks, for example, from controlling a non-bank company, that sort of thing. So it's very important. It assesses mergers. It's been updated many times throughout our history. Title V of the GBLA specifically addresses protecting both the privacy and security of NPPI, or non-public personal information. That has a privacy rule that limits the financial institution's disclosure of NPPI, like to a third party. So when you bring on a vendor as a financial institution, they are going to have some of your third party data. How are you going to ensure through policy NPPI, right? And you have security guidelines as another part of Title V, which addresses safeguarding the confidentiality and security of that very NPPI that we addressed. Okay, so that's a little bit about NPPI. You can read some more on the top of page 410. Now, in a financial institution, right, how do we define it? Any institution, the business of which is significantly engaged in financial activities. That's how it's described. And so it can apply to automobile industry items, credit card companies, credit counselors, data processors, debt collectors, even educational institutions. Interesting, as a financial institution. So we want to apply some regulatory oversight, right? So all of these financial institutions that conduct business, at least in the United States, and I'm sure in most places, are, any of these that conduct business in the United States are subject to the GBLA. I would surmise that there is something similar in other nations, right? And this gives us, in the United States, a way to enforce privacy and security provisions for everyone's good. Now, the FTC has jurisdiction over individuals that are significantly engaged in these financial products or services, right? And they have a Safeguards Act, right, is what the FTC's implementation portion is known as. And so we want to identify and assess the risks, design the safeguards, right? None of this is foreign. They're foreign words to us. So on page 411, it gives a number of regulatory agencies and rules that should be followed. Very interesting, especially if, again, this is your industry, right? Also, you want to keep an eye on the Federal Register. The Federal Register is going to publish any of the FTC guidance that is out there. And so the Office of the Federal Register, under the National Archives and Records Administration, or NARA for short, is going to publish daily an official publication for rules, proposed rules in the U.S. government, and notices, as well as executive orders. And they publish that Monday through Friday. If you want to see more, it's on top of page 412, or you can go to federalregister.gov for more information. Very interesting. So then we ask ourselves, well, okay, what are interagency guidelines, right? Because agencies don't act in a stovepipe. And these guidelines implement a comprehensive written information security program. And so you'll want to include in that administrative controls, technical controls, and physical safeguards. We've talked about those since week 1, right, in that overview that I provided. And these must include the policies and processes, right? We want to involve the board of directors, assess risk, control risk, oversee the arrangements, and adjust the program as necessary. None of that foreign. It sounds just like disaster recovery and the business continuity plan, really, from the previous chapter. And so we want to make sure our security programs involve all of these activities that I just mentioned. Now, the board of directors, right? So interagency guidelines require that the board of directors or some equivalent, right, maybe an executive steering committee that will act on behalf of the board, approve a bank's written information security program, for example. It will generally require you to have some sort of business experience as well as acumen. That's one reason University of North America is such a great institution. It merges the concepts of business and IT into a single degree university. It's great. So it will require you to designate a CISO, Chief Information Security Officer, or a CRO, a Chief Risk Officer. And they give a pretty good, on page 414, pretty good description of the domains that information security will have to address. And at the top, it starts from the board-approved information security program, down aligning that with executive oversight, and even assigning an information security officer, or we prefer a CISO, a Chief Information Security Officer, and the various domains around that: risk management, technology, audit, facilities, IT director, etc., training. So it's an excellent chart to have. And you can find portions of that bubble in the domain slide that I showed in previous lessons. Now, part of this is we want to assess risk, again, not foreign to us in security. So not strange that we would find it particularly in financial institution discussions in terms of security policy. So financial institutions are expected to take a risk-based approach to information security. In fact, we all do, right? We could avoid all risk by shutting down the internet, or we could accept all risk by opening it up wide and having no security, right? Those aren't idyllic anymore. Somewhere in the middle is the sweet spot. So we take a risk-based approach to information security. So we want to understand the threats, the potential dangers, and to continually assess them. Remember, a good policy statement is going to address the threats of unauthorized access, data modification, infiltration, malware, destruction of data systems, and even denial of service. And you'll want to look at risk in terms of inherent risk and even residual risk, right? And they give you some types of risk on page 415, which is a strategic risk, reputational risk, operational risk, transactional risk, and compliance risk. So you'll want to address those forms of risk in the process, okay? And then you'll want to manage that risk. And so interagency guidelines require that we have programs to control and identify risks commensurate with the risk sensitivity, which is something you'll want to do. Notice on page 416 and 417, they've got a chart that shows from the GBLA, that act, the requirements and how they pertain to ISO. So again, if you're in this industry, you'd want to dig through and be familiar with the corresponding ISO 27002 domain. Okay, it's really a must-reading support resource for this Infobase. And if you have never heard of Infobase, you could go to IT Infobase. It's published by the FFIEC, or the Federal Financial Institutions Examination Council. Go there and you can get on that. Very, very interesting. I think you would benefit a lot from that. Now, as always, I've said the cheapest dollar, the best dollar spent in IT security is in education or training. And so the interagency guidelines require institutions to implement ongoing information security awareness programs. This is widely interpreted as embodying the NIST SATA model of security education. So you may want to use that. Human resources security should be a part of that, and we talk about that a little bit when we get to chapter 6. Because the goal of education is to explain why we're doing this, why it happens, what's the understanding. The goal of training is to explain how, and the goal of awareness would be to explain what. Now, testing would also be an important part of this process. So safeguards are meaningful only if they perform as we expect them to perform. So high-risk systems should be subject to independent testing at least once a year, especially if you have data that's a crown jewel, something that could never get out. Boy, test that. And there are things that you can do, 3 common ways to test. Some methodologies are an audit, assessment, and assurance. When you're doing assurance, you could do a black box, white box, or gray box. A black box would be the tester has no prior knowledge of the system or process that's being tested. A white box is they have all the knowledge, and somewhere in the middle is a gray box test, which would say they have some information of the environment that is being tested. Now you want to oversee, of course, the any service provider arrangements, any third-party arrangements, and the interagency guidelines require the financial institutions that service providers to implement security controls in accordance with the GBLA. They say that institutions cannot outsource a task, or they can outsource a task, but cannot outsource the responsibility. So we want to include things like a risk assessment process for vendor management, doing due diligence, contractual assurances, what about non-disclosure agreements, and even coordinating incident response policies. Now, you will always, of course, make adjustments to the program. I always say learn something new every day, right? All training is progressive, right? No different here. So a static information security program is going to give us this false sense of security. Threats are always changing. Organizations change. Modifications to policy have to be made and then communicated to the board, right? Speaking of the board, then you want to report up to the board. They give you some things to report on page 422. I suggest you pause and review that yourself. So you can do a regulatory examination, right? So GBLA requires examination of institutions, and your information technology officer is there'll be a questionnaire involved in the process, and you'll want to review if this interests you, the examination ratings on page 423 to 424. What we're really concerned about, of course, would be theft covered at the end of the chapter on page 424 and 425. That really does wrap it up for us here. This was the last slide on theft, again covered on 424 and 425. Next will be chapter 14.